one of the pioneers in craft beers as a brewery in the suburbs, which opened in 2014. That's around 6 years back. The reason why we opened Brewbot was that we wanted to introduce the craft beer scene similar to how it is in Europe and the US. Unfortunately, the jurisdiction wasn't allowing for craft brewers to come into Mumbai. However, Bangalore is the beer capital of India at the moment, with more than 70 craft breweries at present functioning. Mumbai only had 3 craft breweries which opened in 2014, and we were one of the first ones along with the other 2, and we've been brewing ever since. There's a lot of difference between craft beer and commercial beer, which I'd like to first clear out if anyone has any doubts, and the reasons why you should shift to craft rather than commercial. Now, commercial beers are your beers like your Kingfisher, Budweiser, Heineken, Corona, for example, which are bottled. The shelf life is generally 6 to 8 months. And these are obviously produced in mass, as in they are produced in huge quantities because of the demand and supply. Craft breweries are smaller establishments with probably a 5 hectoliter or a 10 hectoliter plant, which produces a variety of only 500 liters each, maximum say 1,000 liters. Now, since it's an artisanal product, we produce really small quantities, is because once the demand increases, then obviously we can increase the capacity. But for us, the drawback is since we don't add any additives, preservatives, or glycerine in our beer would generally last for around 40 to 45 days. So selling, say, a 500 liter of one particular variety is great if you're able to sell it within 45 days, 50 days. Each variety we make, we have around 9 varieties on tap. We usually do ales rather than lagers, is because ales have, I would say, lesser time as compared to lagers. Lagers usually take 40 to 45 days to make, whereas an ale might take 20 to 24 days. This is another great point. Each variety we make takes, say, for example, 25 days to make, especially after the fermentation and conditioning. So that's the reason why a craft beer tastes so much more better, is because it's conditioned for so long as compared to commercial beer, which is probably made in 4 to 7 days and just bottled immediately. India is yet, I would say, far behind as compared to the US and Europe, where the craft beer scene is. We hope to change that scenario soon. The per capita consumption of beer is very less as compared to Germany. I mean, Germany would probably be 2 liters per person, whereas India would probably be 2 glasses, for example. But obviously, there are more whiskey drinkers in India as compared to anywhere or any other parts of the world. Craft beer is also very easy drinking. You don't get a bloated stomach because there's no glycerine. And there's basically only 2 types of beers which are there in the market, and there's ales and lagers. Ales have around more than 100 to 1,000 varieties, and lagers have more than 100,000 varieties. I'm not going to go into details of each and every variety, because then we would be sitting in the whole day, which I would love to. But yeah, I mean, you can always share our numbers, and we could probably meet at Brewbot once this lockdown is complete, and have a couple of beers and discuss it in more detail. But generally, we make ales is because it's faster. We're able to make a variety of an ale in 20 to 24 days, depending on the fermentation of each variety. Now, each beer is basically four ingredients. I don't know if you all know, some of you might. It's your malt, your hops, your water, and your yeast. Most of us, or I would say, we follow the Reisenbot, which is the purity law of Germany, where you can only use these 4 varieties. You cannot add any more ingredients to it, which makes the beer as pure as it can be. Comparatively, craft beer is very much more healthy as well, is because there's no additives, preservatives, like I had mentioned before. So even if you drink 10 glasses of craft beer, you won't feel bloated as compared to drinking 10 bottles of Kingfisher. Four ingredients. Even though it might sound so easy, it's a very complex process. I would like to go into a little detail of how beer is made, so you guys would also get to know the know-hows of the fermentation, the lautering, the mash kettle, and all that stuff. Sampath, I like your background. Yeah? So basically, like I mentioned earlier, there's ales and lagers. Ales, you have top fermentation, and lagers, you have bottom fermentation. What you do is you basically, for the beer making process, is that you mill the wheat or the malt. When you say mill, is basically you make it into powder form, like you mill your atta and your other flour at mills, which used to be around. Similarly, you mill and you make it into powder form. Now, each variety you make, like it could be, say, a stout, it could be a Hefeweizen, it could be a Belgian wheat, it could be an IPA. Every beer has its own recipes and different strands of yeast which are used. Once the milling is done, you add the milled malt into basically a tank, which is known as the mash kettle, and you add water to it. Now, this is where you mash the grains, so it converts it breaks the enzymes in the grains, so that during fermentation, the sugars in the malt converts into alcohol, ethanol easily. Once this is done, it's transferred to a lauter tun. In the lauter tun, what happens is you remove, now there's a lot of grain which is floating around, which you need to remove from the wort. The wort is basically called beer before alcohol. And to remove the grains, there's sort of a perforated sheet below which, while doing this process, the grains go below the perforated sheet and the wort stays above. So that's basically beer before it gets fermented. And then we remove the wort. Once we remove the spent grain, which is the remaining part of the malt. Spent grain is also used as fodder for animals. It's high in protein. So we usually give it to the bhaiswalas around, the tabelas and all that. They use it to feed the animals. We try and not waste anything we can, and try and reuse whatever we can in whatever way. This is then transferred to a hot water kettle where the hops are added. Now, hops is basically a kind of fruit, vegetable, however you want to call it. Hop is which adds the bitterness and the profile to the beer. Without hops, obviously, beer would just be boiled water. Hops we import from all around the world, depending on the variety again. We import all our malts from around the world, again, depending on the variety. Most of the malt comes from Belgium and Germany. The Indian malt, again, is not as great as a German malt, because the Germans have been making malt for centuries. The characteristics of a German malt are much more superior than an Indian malt. A lot of Indian breweries probably use half and half or 40-60, depending on the variety. But we use 100% imported malt, is because eventually it's the beer and the product which comes out, which is superb. Once the hops added, we have to transfer the wort to the fermentation tanks. Now, what we use is, obviously, we've boiled this at around 70 degrees centigrade. And if you add yeast to 70 degrees, obviously the yeast would die. We need to cool this down to around 18 degrees. So we have something called plate heat exchangers. This I'm just saying in pure basic form. I hope you all are understanding and are following. I don't want to bore you guys. But the plate heat exchangers are basically plates which the hot beer goes through, cools down to 18 degrees, and then reaches the fermentation tank. Once it reaches the fermentation tank, that's where we add the yeast. Again, different varieties have different strains of yeast, which we use. Again, like I mentioned earlier, ales have top fermentation, lagers have bottom fermentation. So depending on the variety, you have to ferment it accordingly. Once the yeast is added, the yeast converts the sugar and the malt into alcohol. Now, a brew cycle would generally take us 8 to 10 hours, and fermentation takes us around 15 days. We have to obviously taste the beer every single day, check the temperatures. We have a PLC, which is basically a semi-automatic uh, computer, which tells us the agitator speeds, the pumps which they're working, if any pump has gone off, or if the temperature from 18 has gone to say 24 in one day, there's an alarm which comes on. So we're able to, keep an eye on all the beers which are fermenting at one point of time. Once the fermentation is done, it's basically put into it's put into lagering and conditioning, where we just let the beer rest. And the more you condition it, the more tasty it is. That's basic funda. And once it's ready, it's transferred to BBTs, which are your bright tanks. BBTs are basically your storage tanks. And from the storage tanks, it comes directly on your tap at the bar. So this whole cycle of the brew making, if you see it, it can't get any fresher than this. Is because there's no bottling, there's no adding of glycerine, there's no kegs involved. It's directly from the tanks through the whole brewing cycle, and it comes directly on tap. Something like how most of restaurants use is from farm to fork, we say grain to glass, for example. It can't get as fresh as this. So this is the basic process. I would love to share any more information how beer is made, or what you guys would like to know.